how could I have known that the world was different for someone else?
It's almost like there's more to ADHD than what's in the DSM. Fantastic.
The first time like Sarah named masking to me, it was just like, oh my God, that's a thing? Like there's a word for this? At least for me, ADHD is probably less of an issue than all of the workarounds I've built on top of it.
Welcome to this week's Research Recap. Today, we are very lucky to have Tobie Langel on the podcast. Tobie is the founder of a consulting firm called UnlockOpen, which helps organizations build symbiotic relationships with open ecosystems. He has advised some of the biggest names in tech that you know, such as Google and Microsoft, and he is also one of our clients at Unconventional Organization, having worked with Sarah since 2022 January. So we wanted to have him on here today to talk more in depth about machine learning and ADHD diagnostics because he is familiar with the area of machine learning and also has ADHD. So welcome, Tobie. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. So the first question I just want to ask, because I think it's an interesting one, at least for me, is where are you currently based?
Oh, I'm in Geneva, Switzerland. So I was actually born and raised here and spent most of my life in Geneva. I did spend a year in Montreal a few years back. And Geneva is an area that's hard to leave. It has everything, the mountains, the lake, an airport. It sucks you in. It's both a good aspect and a bad aspect of the city.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, being based in New Zealand, it's similarly beautiful. And I think you do. It's hard to leave those spaces.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about your ADHD diagnosis journey. What was that like for you?
So that's an interesting story, actually. We were going through a very difficult time as a family unit, actually, to be very honest. And my partner's shrink at some point, as a kind of like an offhand comment, told my partner, doesn't your husband have ADHD? Like, what you're saying about him, makes it sound like you have ADHD. And so my wife came back home and, started Googling about it and learning about it. And the fun story here is we have 3 kids who are clearly, and some have been diagnosed, who are clearly in the space. And so traditionally people my age kind of get diagnosed when their kids are diagnosed. And so there's a little twist in my story, right? And it didn't happen that way. And so essentially my wife comes home, she looks it up, right? Starts reading about it, right? And she's like, oh my God, that's me. Like she saw herself in this, right?
Right.
And so, there's a lot on the topic of ADHD between that women are often misdiagnosed or not diagnosed. Right? Yeah.
They clocked you, but not her.
But what's nuts is what's really incredible is her therapist, who I never met, thought I had ADHD through the comments that she was, the complaints, I guess. I mean, I wasn't there. She was hearing from my wife. But it never occurred to her that her own patient that was right there in front of her had ADHD too. And so we both got diagnosed, right? And so that's how I got diagnosed. So, funny story is I essentially got diagnosed thanks to my wife and my wife thanks to me, kind of. That's the background.
Yeah, no, that is good, but it does speak to that total misdiagnosis of women in the space. That is quite classic, honestly. And tell us a little bit about your career. Obviously you're, founded your own organization. What has your career trajectory been like? It's always a fun question when you have ADHD. Yeah.
So, especially when you find out that you sort of, the way I see this is I thought I had free will all along and made all of these choices. And now I'm looking back at this and I'm like, okay. This is not,
it's very relatable.
None of this was a decision, right? It's, you can sort of all unroll it from the back and be like, oh, okay. It's like when you play chess. If you play chess against a computer, you can sort of, when you lose, unroll the game to see oh yeah, I made this mistake 2 steps ago. When you unroll it and then you look at 2 steps ago and you look at all the other options and you're like none of this works. And, essentially to unroll it from a place where you weren't playing the least bad option, you have to go to the 3rd or 4th play you actually made from the start. Essentially, you lost on the 4th play, right? And, and there was this whole. So this is kind of what my career path looks like, and I don't want to, dismiss the fact that it's a fairly successful one. And, I'm very privileged to be in the position of having the business that I have now and the career that I have. But it did kind of happen as a series of accidents and, this didn't work out. And so, et cetera, right? And increasingly, I believe I ended up in tech, and there's a lot of neurodivergent people in tech, like a lot.
Oh, yes.
And my take on this, so I dropped out of college twice. And tech was kind of like the only career when I was in my 20s where you could actually get a knowledge job without a degree, because there was no degree and it was like, in hyper growth, et cetera, right? And so I'm suspecting that a whole bunch of us ended up in tech because that was our only option, for lack of like a career in a different space. So yeah, I ended up in tech by accident. I was playing music. I was a professional jazz musician, and I needed a website for a band I was touring with. And my brother was playing with computers and showed me a couple of things, and I got instantly hooked on technology. Then every musician in town came to me and said, "Oh, this website looks really nice. Right? Could you make one for me?" And given how hard of a job music is, finding like a side gig like that was a great option, and it turned into a career like fairly quickly by a series of accidents, being in the right place at the right time, essentially.
Yeah. And then you ended up working and advising in various spaces. So in terms of kind of what you do now, you're working in tech, you're advising different companies. I know AI has come in and it's been quite a big focus for a lot of spaces. Tell me a little bit about how it's become a part of what you do and what you're thinking about.
That's a great question. So I think there's like two different angles to this. One is I've been increasingly involved more with the business aspect of technology and the policy side of it for lots of background reasons. Now that sort of make more sense that I'm diagnosed with ADHD, but like related. I've always been very involved with accessibility concerns and also diversity and inclusion in the tech space in general. My background in school was super diverse in Geneva. So like I have this kind of like background of considering that the norm is actually different from what the real norm is. And so I very quickly saw in technology both the potential for really improving people's lives, but also at the same time, the potential for doing exactly the opposite. And so it's one of the really interesting paradoxes of technology, which is just like it's incredibly empowering, but also can be incredibly not and incredibly harmful to especially underrepresented communities. Which is where the diversity angle comes in. So for me, like for a long time, policy and technology needed to like work closer together. And with AI becoming like overnight this thing that has a huge focus on, it is a topic that's coming up like a lot in the policy side. I'm also very involved with open source and the question of like how open the AI models that we're using today is a really important one. And it's one that really resonates with like my experience in technology. And then the other aspect is there is something in the air around AI today that feels a lot like the way technology was in the early days of what was called Web 2.0 when I really started getting involved, which was really about people building cool stuff.
Yes.
In a very sort of like was lots of agency and creativity and experimentation. And this really sort of like very different from the sort of highly industrialized way that technology overall has transformed over the last decade. So there's very sort of like do it yourself, kind of like tinker with stuff. And I love that, right? Like I like that, that feeling. I love it. See, I hadn't made that link. Yes, absolutely. But I think also it has something very empowering for people to be able to tinker with technology and see what it can do for them or what kind of problems it can solve for them. And so I sort of like dug back into AI in a very tinkery, product focused phase. So it's both of these angles, really, the playful and the policy one.
Yeah, no, and I completely understand what you mean. I think we have felt that too recently, not necessarily in terms of AI, but that feeling of being able to figure it out yourself and try things and having that have an impact, because it is such lots of new spaces. Definitely.
Yeah. And the fact that the technology is so new and so it lacks the kind of organizational complexity that builds over time.
Yeah. Hasn't been bureaucratized.
Right. Like a one-person team can build products, right? I mean, and you can't build an application on a phone today, like a one-person app that competes seriously with something that a 200 people team creates, right? But like in this AI space right now, yeah, you can tinker and build amazing things. So
yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of people in the audience who are going, really? Oh, that's interesting. I might get into it. It's
fun. They should.
Exactly. And if you are, in fact, that is what we're going to be talking about today. Is we're going to be diving a little bit more into machine learning and ADHD using kind of the paper that we talked about a few weeks ago. So for those of you who didn't listen or need a recap, working memory being what it is, Sarah is going to just give us a little outline of that paper, which essentially looked at how we can diagnose people with ADHD, what it means, and we'll talk a little bit more about machine learning, kind of using that as a funnel, if you will. So Sarah, do you want to summarize that paper and give us a title as well?
Yes, please. I'm so excited to talk about this paper again. It's sort of like a new thing. So the paper is called Machine Learning in ADHD, New Approaches Toward Understanding the Neural Mechanism. So basically, this paper was just looking at machine learning in the application of diagnostics. How accurate, how sensitive were these AI models in predicting ADHD or not ADHD? And this was a meta-analysis. So I think there were like 70 citations in this paper, which is really exciting because sort of we got to look at a bunch of different measures, right? They used MRI, fMRI, EEG, genetics data, sort of all of these different things independently, fed them into models and then measured to see which ones were good. And the long and short of it is most of these models were 69 to 96% sensitive, meaning that they were able to capture ADHD in 69 to 96% of the cases.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which, according to their data, was higher than what you would get if you did a professional DSM diagnosis currently.
So the DSM criteria was one of the models, and it was not very good. Yeah, it was less than 24% accurate at predicting the ADHD, which is interesting. It's almost like there's more to ADHD than what's in the DSM. Fantastic.
Say it isn't so. Okay, so we're going to jump in then, and we're going to talk a little bit about what is this machine learning anyway, and what this could mean for ADHD. Yeah. So, Tobie, what is machine learning? How does it work?
So I want to be very clear here, right? I am not a machine learning expert. Like, I understand like the technology. I've used it. I understand sort of like the social impact it can have. The specifics of like training, I can sort of vaguely gloss over, right? But I am not like, I'm not an expert in the field. And so I might also, if there are experts listening, please, like, I don't know if you can comment or like...
Yes, email us and then we'll invite you on.
If I'm saying like horribly wong things, I'm entirely sorry. I was dragged into this call against my will. That's going to be my excuse.
That is not true.
Sorry. As is often the case when I read or gloss over papers of that nature, I'm entirely surprised that anyone is actually surprised about this outcome. Like, I mean, essentially, machine learning is incredibly good at pattern matching, right? It's like all of the new large language models, they're essentially just pattern matching and making up the pattern that makes the most sense given the input. I mean, that's basically the gist of it. Right.
So explain the pattern matching idea. So you said that they're good at pattern matching. And obviously we have a sense of what pattern matching is in school. We have to, what is the next thing that goes into it. But what does it mean for AI to be pattern matching?
So on a very high level, what a large language model essentially does is it absorbs a lot of content and essentially turn this content in what could be seen as like it's called like vector embeddings is like the a term of the art for like the output of that process. It's essentially organizing content in a way that it has lots of information and sort of weights about lots of different categories of things. Right. So, for example, like, I mean, this is not how it's actually in the model, but the way you can think about this is like you would have an apple and it would be green. It would have like, it would, taste juicy and, it would have all of these different sort of like features and each of them would be sort of like rated on a scale kind of. Right. And when you input like a prompt in a model like this, right, essentially the prompt is turned into a similar embedding. And then it's really easy to pattern match because you look at all of the things that are juicy and all of the things that are green and all of the things that are a shiny skin. And you're going to get an apple, but you're also going to get Shrek,
Yeah, that's such a great way to think about it.
It's kind of like how you have these suddenly weird things that like sort of like connect, right? And when you think about this, like inference of that nature, right? Like pattern matching is not really intelligence, but it's a lot closer to expertise. David C. Baker, who's described as the expert's expert. So he's actually a consultant that helps consultant like me that work like in very niche domain to essentially improve the way they function as a business. He likes to talk about expertise as being the ability to pattern match.
Yes. Right? That's so interesting.
So when you think about expertise as pattern matching and we think about AI as pattern matching, it's kind of like the outcome is kind of obvious, right? Like AI is to a large degree an expert at like pattern matching. And typically, we know enough about ADHD to know that it's fairly clear that like there are patterns, right? Like,
Like it's funny you should say that. That's kind of what we do in coaching. Like a lot of what we're doing is we're taking, everybody's life. We're looking for patterns in terms of executive functioning difficulties. Yeah. And so people will sort of say, oh, well, this part, like, it's not going to be relevant or it's too complicated. It's like, probably not because of that pattern matching. And so you're sort of saying, and this makes a lot of sense, is machine learning is doing the same thing.
I mean, essentially, the way you can think of like, I mean, there are different models of machine learning, right? So I don't know, and I also don't know enough about it to be able to like make astute comments about the difference between them and which one would make most sense.
That's okay.
For what.
Getting to grips with machine learning in general is a good goal.
Roughly speaking, you can think of it as how can you boil down a large set of content into a system where you can really easily sort of pattern match or ask questions. To some degree, asking a question, like prompting a question is kind of pattern matching for the thing that you're talking about, right? Plus the concept of asking questions, right? And so it goes, oh, we're talking about this. Oh, and we're asking questions. And when we're asking questions, like usually people, like they do answers, right? So, it's essentially sort of like this probabilistic, deterministic thing of given this, we're pattern matching. And that's kind of like the output that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Yeah.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. Sarah, did you have any other questions you wanted to add on that before we get into how this works for ADHD?
I don't think so. I mean, what I heard from him is that instead of like hiring new ADHD coaches, we could build one.
Oh, so that is a bold jump.
Super ambitious. But would you expect anything less? I mean, ADHD
well, actually,
people.
Training the AI model is exactly what we're about to discuss. So it kind of relates.
That is, no, but that's a really interesting conversation, though. So before we get into this, there's a couple of things I just wanted to say about the study in general. So I didn't dig into it specifically, but I think one of the things that would be interesting, since it's a study of studies, is to find out when each part was studied, because it's a field that's moving incredibly fast, right? So whatever data we have now is different than 6 weeks ago. Right.
Yeah. No.
And that's going to be increasingly true because there are huge investments being made right now. And we're really at a inflection point where we're going to start essentially industrialization of a lot of this stuff. Yeah. And so costs are going to go down, a lot of things are going to happen. I mean, to the comment you were just making right now, Sarah, people are going to imagine that we can do a lot more with it than we can really do. So there's going to be disappointment. In the next year or so. But then clearly this is technology that has huge potential and can really solve a bunch of problems. And so, if the data now wasn't entirely clear, I'm pretty sure that in a couple of years it will be, right? That said, I think I really see, given that it is expertise pattern matching, right? You can think of AI in general as an intern, an assistant that can really easily go do research for you, right? But doesn't have the experience and the background in the field to actually have a sixth sense for, oh yeah, that makes sense, or that looks really fishy, right? When you've been in the field for a long time, you can just see, no, there's something wrong here, right? And so AI won't do this, and that's why we have all the whole hallucination kind of problems, right? It can just make it up. And typically, if you had an intern, right, it could be the same thing. Your intern can have partied the night before, and essentially still have something to do in the morning, and kind of make it up, right? And so you can't put someone in the hands of a tool like this without someone that's there to make sure that things are okay. On the other hand, right? And I think that's super important, because when we compare, the kind of results that OpenAI, ChatGPT, or related tools give you, when you start, asking questions around mental health, for example, right? When we compare that kind of output with what the best psychiatrist in, one of the biggest cities in the world, who also chairs the university brand thing on the topic, right, would tell you, of course, ChatGPT is entirely kind of lacking, right? But the reality is most people get their mental health from TikTok videos or incredibly bad and outdated local psychologists or psychiatrists that very often don't even know. Here people are still using terminology in Geneva, Switzerland. It's one of the richest places in the world, right? And people are still using terminology to talk about HD that's pre-DSM-4. Right, even they don't even call it ADHD; they call it this other weird thing that it really no longer works. Right, in French, there is in between. Yes, let's build AI coaches, and oh my God, AI is dangerous and wrong. There is a real field where, at least on an individual basis, I want to be able to have the right and the ability to figure out for myself, and I'm an adult, right? Manage my risks and get the kind of information I want from a tool like this in order to manage my own health issues the best way I can, given the reality of what's being offered to me from the institutional system is lacking is an understatement.
That's a really good point. I think a good question to kind of take from that is, I guess if you think about your own ADHD diagnosis and similar diagnoses experiences, what do you think that AI could do based on this paper, but also on your knowledge in general, to adjust the way that this diagnostic process is going to go, potentially?
It is unclear from my personal history whether there was a suspicion of something related when I was a kid or not. Like, I remember taking tests in school. They thought I had dyslexia, which they
they
ruled
thought
out.
the same for me, actually. Yeah.
It was like this kind of like weird thing, and my parents weren't super clear. And like, there was, at least in Europe, kind of like this Ritalin scare, because it was felt like it was, an American thing. Like they were drugging their children. It's like this weird thing. So how much was I actually diagnosed then or not, like, will remain entirely unclear. But to me, the concern isn't as much that I got a diagnostic once essentially someone told me you have ADHD, right? It was, I had to wait for like 42 years for someone to say, oh, you might have ADHD, right? So it's kind of like the pre-diagnostic problem. Like even knowing that there is something wrong with you that, is medical, right? For lack of a better words.
Yeah, no, like, I get that. I walked into my first year of my doctorate and was like, oh, I have ADHD. That was how I found out.
Yeah. Weird, right? And so I feel like lightweight pre-diagnostic tools, cheap tools that can be deployed at scale, for example, for kids in schools, right? I mean, there's lots we can imagine, right? Like, so, I mean, here there are lots of different kind of data that was looked at, right? But maybe you can do incredibly quick analysis using eye movements in class. Like, what do I know? Right. So, there's probably like very lightweight things where you can say, raise a flag. And like, if you can raise a flag in pretty much all of the cases, and, maybe you pre-diagnose a few people, right? But like, it's sufficiently accurate that you don't miss too many and that you don't have too many false positives. Then suddenly you can imagine like this being kind of like a health check, right? You're like in 6th grade or something or whatnot. And you just, you get this, like like here we get like a dental visit and like, a bunch of different things, right? You can imagine the same kind of things happening here. And then whether you actually use like what kind of diagnostic happens later, that's a second issue. I'm more interested in sort of the pre-diagnostic phase.
I wonder how we used to diagnose like eye troubles before they came up with that chart.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I feel like we're talking about that right now, but different.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, that's a really good example. Like, I got diagnosed with my glasses by a teacher, right? I was at the back of the class, like we were, in a small group at the back of the class, and I was in 6th grade. I remember she was called Mrs. Price. So like it's, the memory of that is like super vivid. I was in that room, and we were in the classroom, and we're in the back as a small group of kids, like 6 or 7, I don't know. And then she looks at me and tells me, "Can you just tell me what is on the board?" Because she was like her back to the board or something. And I just laughed. Like, you can't see anything from this distance on a board, right? And she looked at me and she was like, yeah, you should be able to. And if you can't see anything from there, you might want to see if you need glasses, right? And so I went home, I might need glasses. And so, that's a really simple thing, right? Yeah. And, it prevented me from like not wearing glasses for my, for the rest of my life, right? Or finding out when I was 40 that I actually needed glasses. Could be the same thing.
Yeah, that is actually an interesting point though, because, for you, it was a moment with a teacher that led to you realizing you had needed glasses. But if we say on the metaphor, say that teacher hadn't picked up on it, or she'd just gone, whatever, and hadn't really thought much more of it, and there hadn't been any general test for glasses at the time, you could have gone a very long time without knowing you needed glasses.
I mean, I found out about ADHD like 3 years ago. I know this is the exact point we're making, but the other thing I found out about very recently is I actually have what's called aphantasia, or like nearly, which is I don't see anything when I close my eyes, so I can't imagine anything. Like I can't picture stuff, and I just, like it never occurred to me that people could actually do that. And now as I've had conversation, like my wife can like imagine music in her head and like isolate the instruments and stuff. And she's not a musician. Like I was a trained musician, and there's no way I could do even like 1% of this in my head, right? So it's kind of like, how could I have known that the world was different for someone else, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And colorblind is a good example. So all of these things, AI or machine learning could be very helpful. But I want to touch on something because I know there's people here going, that sounds great, except I don't want there to be some kind of blanket. Because in some cases, there are situations where I'm thinking more of autism than ADHD here, but it can affect your employment history. It can affect a lot of things in your life. There's places where people don't want to like have that information publicly available, for example. So in terms of policy, what do you think that, and again, we're talking theoretical future here, but what are some of the issues that kind of testing could actually bring?
I mean, that's true regardless of the diagnostic, right? I mean, sure, scaling things tends to aggravate problems when there are problems, right? But it's not very different. I mean, whatever kind of policy framework you have today to manage healthcare, health-related information or religion-related information. I mean, there is a reason in history why people are always concerned when this comes up, right? And it's good to be concerned about this. But outside of like scale, I don't really see like an additional problem here. I mean, I think like the policy frameworks that we have are already pretty good to manage like this additional level of information. For example, like I no longer have access to private medical insurance in Switzerland because I've been diagnosed with ADHD.
Wow.
Right? Yeah,
that's
pretty
intense.
nuts. So I can have the base level, but I cannot get private one. And even if for everything. So if I had if I say I wanted private healthcare in case I have a cancer, because I've been diagnosed with ADHD, I can't get it. Right. So this is already a problem now, like regardless of like what kind of what kind of diagnostic method we've used. So the question, I mean, to some degree, even maybe extending and scaling this is going to make these kinds of problems more obvious. Right.
Yeah. When it's actually a percentage of the population, there might be more of a sense of like, we can't do this. It's going to affect too many people's lives. And there is a conversation to be had as well about the cultural shift that a widespread diagnosis of ADHD would have in terms of understanding what ADHD is. Because, even today, people say, oh, you work with people who have ADHD, and they assume that we work with children. And when you say, no, you work with like business professionals, adults who have ADHD, they sort of just look at you slightly confused often because it's such a unknown group of individuals.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I work at tech, so like so many people I know have ADHD. It's kind of like whenever I actually mention it, people are like, "Oh, welcome to the club." So it's like I live an entirely different reality, right?
Yeah,
like for me, this is
all
like
these little bubbles.
yeah, it's kind of. I mean, I'm not going to say it's the norm, but I mean, yeah, actually, it's like a running joke in tech. Tech has a really bad rep for diversity for an entirely, very good reason. I mean, that's very true, right? But then if people have started talking about like adding mental health into diversity questions, and then like it shifts it in a completely weird way. Like the joke is, well, now everyone is, is diversity.
Very
right? All of these white dudes, they all have like, on the spectrum or have ADHD for sure. So it's kind of like, yes, it's an entire bubble. I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, we could honestly talk about this forever, and we'll probably, have you back on at some point, maybe to keep the conversation going. If you do have any questions, feel free to email myself or Sarah. We'll be happy to talk to speak to those or pass on anything. But I wanted to take a little bit of time as well and just talk about your journey with Unconventional organization, because you've been working here with us for 2 years. Although it's my first time meeting you because you've been Sarah's client. So tell us a little bit about what's happening in your life that led you to decide to actually seek out coaching.
So I was diagnosed, I think 1 year before, like a little over 1 year before I started being coached. And so I think that I was already had been taking medication for close to a year when we started working together. And so, we talked about the diagnostic here and, the general state of mental health and the stigma that is ADHD, even with mental health professionals and even with mental health professionals at the ADHD facility at the, University of the medical school, right? And so I had to find first of all, a practitioner that wasn't, didn't want to prescribe antidepressant instead, didn't think that ADHD was a thing only for children, as we were talking about earlier. So there was lots of different weird things like this. So it took me a long time to get medication prescribed. And also I kind of I have a job, I have a spouse, I have children, I have a car, I have a house, I have a dog. I check all
the
these
things you're
check
not
boxes
supposed
off,
to get with ADHD.
Yeah, you don't have ADHD. You don't need medication, right? And as I mentioned, we were in a pretty difficult time as a family unit, and I was very scared of medication. Right, the whole idea of taking meds for me was just for the brains was just oh my God, this is going to change who I am. The whole sort of spiel, right? And so because of the added pressure of it was COVID, family was really not doing well. It's just I'm going to try anything at this point. Meds, I'll do meds, no problem, right? And so I kind of did that. I would never have jumped too much anxiety to actually do something like that beforehand. And for me, the impact of medication was amazing, incredibly quickly, really amazing. And I was hoping to do meds plus get coaching, and I couldn't get coaching here. It was just it was this weird desert. And so my wife, again, one day said, hey, I looked at this, or I saw or maybe I listened to the podcast. I don't remember.
Yeah.
She said, maybe you want to look at that. And I did. And I think back then there was not that many of you. It was
no, it was probably
Sarah,
me,
maybe
Sarah.
Just us.
Yeah.
Oh, it was just the two of you?
Yeah, it was just yeah.
And one of them was very far away and the other one less so.
That was me. Yeah.
And so I picked the less so one. Also, most of my clients in the US. And so it was really easy for it worked well with my sort of scheduling. And so we started working together. And what's interesting now, I'm remembering this. I hadn't thought about this in a long time. So what's interesting is at the start, I was really not thinking it was going to get anywhere. It was just I can try that too. I've tried many things, what the hell? Yeah. And it took a couple of calls for me to start seeing where this could go. And so I think it's actually super important because if I hadn't dug into it, I would have missed on for me, this has been an amazing 2 years. I was surprised that it's been so long, so little time. Sorry, because for me it feels like it's been I don't know, if you ask, I would say 10 years. Of course, it's we've always been there's no time where this wasn't going on. And no, for me it's been incredibly enriching, at so many points. And, Sarah really was there for me at a time where things were really difficult, on a personal level. And things are much better now, thankfully, right?
So many ways.
No, absolutely. It was a real help in moments where it was really difficult, but it's also grown way beyond. I don't know how to, I've been kind of struggling to describe it.
Yeah. Well, I guess you mentioned that once you started it, the first couple of sessions, you sort of saw where this could go. And I'm curious what you meant by that.
Well, I don't know. I'm making this up now. I don't it's hard for me to exactly say. I'd love to say that it's coaching in general that works really well like this. But I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot here or but I think Sarah has an amazing set of skills around that work, right? Seriously, I don't know, once every 3 or 4 sessions, I'm just come in like this and I'm kind of like not really committed to the thing because I have a whole bunch of other things going on. I'm like, this is going to be nice,
So
right?
classic.
And then I say something, right? And like, but it's just like, it's like this whole sort of like unfolding of things that come from, frankly, from Sarah's ability to, I don't even know what it is. I think if I knew what it is, I would be doing that work too. But like, no, but like, it's like, it's a combination of understanding the theory behind what's going on and like how the brain actually works and how also trauma works and a whole bunch of like psychological background and sensitivity and a willingness to like be vulnerable and like create space for the me to feel like I can be vulnerable. It's all of these things. And it's been a huge growth opportunity for me. And it's been like incredibly fulfilling. Like it's hard to like,
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting to hear. I mean, when we first started, we are using a combination of neuroscience and academia, which is my background, and obviously an understanding of ADHD to build a sort of very strong ADHD coaching process, which is different from a normal coaching process where, we're focusing on those fundamentals, and then we're focusing on the workplace, and we're focusing on relationships, and we're kind of bringing in all of these strategies and frameworks. And yeah, it's interesting to hear what that looks like from the other side. I always find that such a fascinating experience to see how that looks from the other side.
My suspicion is I kind of rammed my way into this whole thing was like the set of circumstances, at which I showed up, which are probably common. Like, I don't know. I don't have any data, right?
Yeah,
but I'm suspecting
common.
that a lot of folks that end up being diagnosed in their 40s when their kids are diagnosed are dealing with a number of traumatic things at the same time, right? Because you get your kids diagnosed because there's a whole bunch of things that are not working the way they should. And also you're exhausted and you're also at an age where managing like your ADHD is super difficult, increasingly so. And so I'm suspecting like crisis is probably the norm of the people that show up at your doorstep.
It is.
Right?
We're building a framework for the academy right now. And there's like a level 0, which is just the first step is just to figure out whatever the crisis is and work with that. Because there's always something.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Yeah. So for me, in that chaos, it really, I think it really clicked with me because the thing was people who have ADHD and, I hate generalizing, but my understanding, and at least the way I'm wired is I actually want to understand stuff. Like if you're just telling me that I'm supposed to do something and you don't explain to me why, then I just think it's stupid and I don't do it. Right. Sometimes purposefully, which is really silly, but and so I think that the fact that things are anchored into why, and this is, or just having things named, like the first time, like Sarah named masking to me, it's just like, oh my God, that's a thing. Like there's a word for this, And so I think that this kind of like slow delivery of knowledge, like information about the thing that ADHD does to people, about like what I have in a way that's very related to actual, the lived experience of the thing, right? The thing that you were just crying about 5 minutes ago, it's actually called this. And it sounds like that, like so my wife teaches, right? From a teaching perspective, that is great because it's like anchored into experience, into emotions, into a whole bunch of things. It's like, I will never forget what masking is, right? Because, it was labeling the lived experience of like what that was. I don't know if that's part of the structure of like how you work, but
yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So this actually shows through, but in a way that it's not explicit. It's like implicit. It's also not the word I was looking for. But anyway, so God, that was hard to describe.
No, that's very, very cool. I really, really appreciate you digging into it. I mean, it's always sort of like you're on one side kind of doing it and delivering it. And it's really interesting to hear how it's delivered, especially from somebody who's been working with Sarah for so long. Yeah, I am curious now, if you think about your own experiences now, having gone through this 2 years that felt like 10 years experience, do you have any kind of, no, totally in a good way. Do you have any kind of sense of what is different now? Because it sounds like a lot of systems kind of shifted, and I'm just curious.
So many things. God, this is so difficult to explain. No, because it's both sort of like very menial and very personal things, and also like very large things. Like it's really, really hard to describe. Like it's funny. Recently, I saw a tweet of like some ADHD influencer talking about, what are your top things to help like someone who has just recently been diagnosed with ADHD, right? And people were like suggesting things like fidgets and like a whole bunch of things. I was just like, I can so not relate to any of this, right? Like the sort of like kind of very tactical, classically ADHD things like are entirely, they don't really resonate with me. And I don't feel like those are transformative. Like they feel like they're kind of like a fixing the symptoms more than addressing the causes. And so I feel like I've spent 2 years addressing causes and sort of like unwinding strategies, like workaround strategies. So I would say like the things that have changed is I have a much, much deeper understanding of how I function, how my brain works. So my current thesis is that at least for me, ADHD is probably less of an issue than all of the workarounds I've built on top of it. Right. And so regardless of like how much I'm taking medication also, which helps. Right.
Yes.
But
yeah.
It feels like a lot of the work is like fixing essentially like bad habits that have been built to like manage things in a very ineffective way. And so I would say what changed is I have a much better understanding of myself. I'm much better, much more in the moment and much more mindful. Ta-da.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. It's an internal joke.
I know. Sarah talks about it on the podcast all the time as well.
Okay. But not in a kumbaya kind of way. Like I'm just like much more present to stuff, and I can just I can take a distance with myself and sort of actually engage into thinking about what it is that I want to be doing, or whether the behavior I'm having right now is appropriate, or all of that kind of stuff. And so, it's this kind of like zooming ability, between the different state of minds, or that I feel like really has changed more than like specific things. I mean, sure, it has huge impact. Like I can actually like wake up in the morning and get dressed because I have made a bunch of decisions about what to wear. That like, so I'm not like spending a half an hour in bed wondering, okay, why am I not waking up? Right? Because I actually don't know what I'm going to do today, so I don't know what I want to wear, and because and so I can't make too many decisions, so I'm just like lying down. So
yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I just have one more question for you, which is, for those people who are listening to you, who are like, man, that's a cool industry. I love what he does. Do you have any advice for kind of younger ADHD you who's maybe at the beginning of your journey in this kind of space?
Oh, well, get a diagnostic.
Find out you have ADHD.
Yeah. So that's the first thing. I was incredibly lucky because I got into tech at a time where not having a diploma wasn't an issue. I don't think that would work out today. I mean, essentially getting a diagnostic then becomes essential to being able to get the kind of degrees you need to be able to get that kind of job. So either do that or find out whatever next sort of field will have this kind of like a window of opportunity where you can wiggle your way in. If you were unable to complete the kind of studies you would have wanted to do otherwise. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I don't know, I kind of cherish the wild and crazy aspects of my personality that are tied to ADHD. And so do that too. Like it's not because, it's not because it can sometimes be hard to manage or dangerous or awkward or, that it is not A, also part of you, and B, also, valuable and rich and worth tapping into, right?
Yeah.
And so don't lose that in the process of getting your ADHD fixed.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us, Tobie. I really, really appreciate it. Tell people where they can find out more about you. I think a lot of people will be very curious to hear from you.
I used to be very active on Twitter, and unfortunately, this kind of went to the way it went. And so I am less so. A lot of the tech sort of ecosystem moved to LinkedIn out of all places. So I do spend a little more time there. And if not, people can email me at Tobie@UnlockOpen.com. UnlockOpen is my firm. Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to chat about ADHD and ADHD in tech. If people want to reach out, that's entirely fine.
Awesome.
I do that on a regular basis at this point. So, yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, it was really nice to meet you, Tobie. It's always so fun to meet the really interesting people who work, who are connected with us at Unconventional Organization and learn more about you. And I think that, what you've said today, I feel like I understand machine learning a lot better than I did before this podcast. And I hope a lot of other people feel the same way. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there. If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD Lab next week.